Jake Miller blinked awake, his head pounding like a bad hangover after a night he didn't remember. The first thing he noticed was the strange glow above him, a ceiling that shimmered and pulsed with soft, alien light. The second thing was the clinking of chains on his wrists. He jerked upright, but his hands were locked in some sort of smooth, unyielding metal restraints. "What the hell?" His words echoed across the vast chamber. He looked around and saw towering figures, their skin shimmering like molten silver, standing in a half-circle around him. Behind them loomed an immense throne, carved from what looked like living crystal, glowing faintly. Sitting on it was a figure unlike any he'd ever seen. Tall and regal, with sharp, angular features that shimmered with a faint golden hue. She was draped in intricate robes that seemed to shift and flow like liquid light. Her eyes, glowing like twin suns, pinned him in place. "Is this a dream?" Jake muttered to himself, but the sharp cold of the cuffs told him otherwise. "Silence," barked one of the guards, stepping forward with a weapon that looked suspiciously like a spear made of pure energy. "Hey, no need to get stabby," Jake said, raising his hands, or trying to, until the restraints yanked him back down. The woman on the throne, who Jake quickly deduced was in charge, raised a hand, silencing the guard. Her voice was calm, authoritative, and oddly melodic when she spoke. "You are the one the summoning stone delivered to us. Your presence here is not a mistake, human." Jake blinked. "Summoning stone? Delivered? Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of sci-fi Renaissance fair you've got going here, but I think there's been a mix-up. I was working on my car an hour ago. Now I'm here, chained up, and—" "You will address her as Empress Sarathka," one of the guards snapped. The Empress raised her hand again, silencing the interruption. "You are here because our empire faces annihilation. The Oblivion Swarm, an enemy that adapts to every weapon and strategy, threatens to consume all we hold dear. Our most ancient prophecies spoke of a creature from the Forgotten Fringe, a being of chaos and ingenuity who could turn the tide. You human are that creature." Jake stared at her, stunned into silence for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Me? Prophecy? Lady, your majesty, I'm just a mechanic. I fix cars. I don't save galaxies." Sarathka's glowing eyes narrowed. "And yet you are here. Fate has chosen you." Before Jake could argue further, a deafening screech shattered the air. The guards immediately formed a defensive line, their energy weapons igniting. From above, the crystalline ceiling began to crack, and grotesque shapes started to pour through. Creatures that looked like metallic insects fused with writhing tentacles. "Oblivion scouts," shouted one of the guards. Panic surged through Jake as chaos erupted around him. The guards engaged the invaders with precision, their weapons carving through the swarm. But for every creature they killed, another seemed to emerge, adapting to their attacks. Jake tugged at his restraints, his survival instincts kicking in. "Hey, a little help here," he yelled. The Empress flicked her fingers, and Jake's cuffs snapped open. "Prove your worth, human," she said, her voice calm even as the battle raged around her. Jake dove to the ground as one of the creatures lunged at him, its snapping mandibles inches from his face. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could help. He spotted a fallen guard's weapon, a sleek energy rifle, and grabbed it. "Okay, let's see how this works," Jake muttered, fumbling with the alien controls. When a creature charged at him, he instinctively pulled the trigger. The weapon hummed to life, firing a bright blue bolt that disintegrated the attacker. "Not bad," he said, a grin forming despite himself. As the battle intensified, Jake's resourcefulness kicked in. Spotting a cluster of enemies overwhelming a guard, he ripped a glowing crystal from the wall and hurled it at them. The makeshift weapon exploded on impact, scattering the creatures. The Empress watched from her throne, her expression unreadable. "Interesting," she murmured. The tide of the battle began to turn. With Jake improvising distractions and using the environment to his advantage, the remaining guards managed to push back the invaders. When the last creature fell, the chamber was eerily quiet. Jake stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily, his borrowed weapon still in hand. He looked up at the Empress, his eyes blazing with defiance. "So," he said, "this is what you dragged me into? Prophecies and bug monsters? You've got the wrong guy." The Empress rose from her throne, her glowing robes shifting like liquid fire. "Perhaps. But for now, you are all we have." Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Great. Just great." As the guards began clearing the wreckage, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn for the surreal and the dangerous. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" he thought. And the Empress, watching him with a calculating gaze, was wondering the same thing. Jake trudged into the Empire's war training grounds, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. The previous night had been a whirlwind of explanations about the Oblivion Swarm, the Empress's prophecy, and why, apparently, he was the answer to an intergalactic apocalypse. He still wasn't buying it. But here he was, about to endure some sort of training, surrounded by towering alien soldiers who clearly didn't think much of him. "Human," barked Commander Arwail Van, a stern figure with crimson skin and gleaming silver armor. His glowing eyes narrowed with disdain. "This facility is designed to test and prepare warriors for the swarm. You are no warrior. I doubt you'll last 5 minutes." "Nice pep talk," Jake shot back. "You do birthday parties too?" The soldiers chuckled, but Arwail Van silenced them with a glare. "Enough. Begin the simulation." The training ground shimmered, the bioorganic walls transforming into a dense jungle of twisting vines and jagged rocks. Metallic creatures, virtual representations of the Oblivion Swarm, burst from the shadows, their sharp limbs gleaming. Jake's heart raced as a spear-like weapon materialized in his hands, seemingly summoned by the facility's advanced tech. "Right," he muttered. "No pressure." The first creature lunged, and Jake reacted instinctively, swinging the spear like a baseball bat. The strike sent the creature flying into a tree, but a second one leapt at him from behind. Jake barely managed to dodge, tumbling into a thorny bush. "Pathetic," Arwail Van muttered from the observation deck. Jake scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging. The spear felt awkward in his hands. Alien tech clearly wasn't designed for human ergonomics. He tossed it aside and grabbed a rock instead, hurling it at the nearest creature with surprising accuracy. It hit a vulnerable joint, and the creature crumpled. Jake grinned despite himself. "Okay, maybe I can do this." The simulation escalated, the swarm multiplying and adapting to his tactics. Jake quickly realized he couldn't rely on brute force alone. He started improvising, ripping vines to create tripwires, luring enemies into natural choke points, and using environmental hazards to his advantage. The soldiers watching from the observation deck began murmuring among themselves. "He's unconventional," one said. "More like reckless," another muttered. Arwail Van remained stone-faced, though his eyes tracked Jake's every move. By the time the simulation ended, Jake was covered in cuts and bruises but still standing. The jungle faded back into the training ground, and Jake dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. "So," he said between gulps of air, "how'd I do?" Arwail Van descended from the observation deck, his expression cold. "You survived. Barely. Your methods are crude, inefficient, and undisciplined." Jake wiped sweat from his brow. "And yet, here I am, alive." The commander's jaw tightened. "Do not mistake survival for success, human." This was only the beginning. Before Jake could reply, Empress Sarathka entered the room, her golden robes shimmering. The soldiers immediately straightened, saluting her. She approached Jake, her piercing gaze studying him. "You improvised," she said. Jake shrugged. "Yeah, well, that's kind of what humans do." Sarathka nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is why you were chosen." She turned to Arwail Van. "He requires further preparation. Focus on his ingenuity. Let him turn it into an asset." Arwail Van's lips tightened, but he bowed. "As you command, Empress." As Sarathka turned to leave, she paused, looking back at Jake. "Rest, human. Tomorrow's tests will be far less forgiving." Jake groaned as he pushed himself to his feet. "Can't wait." As he watched the Empress leave, He couldn't shake the feeling that she saw something in him no one else did. Not even himself. For better or worse, he was in this now. Jake stood in the cold, sterile expanse of the research facility, his breath misting in the air. Unlike the vibrant and organic structures he'd seen in the Empire's cities, this place was stark and lifeless, its walls gleaming with polished black metal. A faint hum vibrated beneath his boots, the sound of ancient technology barely holding itself together. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake muttered. Empress Sarathka, walking ahead of him, glanced back. "This facility predates the Empire itself. It was built by our ancestors when the Oblivion Swarm was first created." Jake stopped short. "Wait, created? You're saying someone made those things?" She nodded solemnly. "Long ago, in a time of war, the swarm was designed as the ultimate bioweapon. Adaptive, unstoppable, and capable of consuming entire civilizations. But their creators underestimated their own invention. The swarm turned on them, and their empire fell." Jake let out a low whistle. "And now they're coming for yours. Figures." Sarathka said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. They arrived at a large circular chamber. In the center stood a massive crystalline structure, glowing faintly with an inner light. Around it, holographic displays projected streams of alien text and images. Scientists, tall, insectoid figures with translucent exoskeletons, buzzed around, making adjustments. "What's this?" Jake asked, stepping closer. "This," Sarathka said, gesturing to the crystal, "is the core of memory. It holds the accumulated knowledge of those who fought the swarm in ancient times. It is how we discovered the prophecy that led us to you." One of the scientists approached, its mandibles clicking. "Your Majesty, the data is ready for extraction." Sarathka nodded and turned to Jake. "Step forward." Jake hesitated. "Why do I feel like this is going to be unpleasant?" "Because it will be," Sarathka said flatly. Before he could protest, a beam of light shot from the crystal, enveloping him. Jake gasped as his mind was flooded with images. Alien battlefields, towering cities reduced to ash, and the relentless advance of the swarm. But amid the chaos, one image stood out. A human figure, standing defiantly against the tide. The beam faded, and Jake stumbled back, clutching his head. What the hell was that?" Sarathka's gaze was steady. "Confirmation. The swarm cannot adapt to human biology or ingenuity. Your kind's unpredictability, your chaotic methods. They are your greatest strength." Jake frowned. "So you brought me here to, what? Be a mascot? Some kind of galactic guinea pig?" "No," Sarathka said. "We need your help to create a weapon. Something only a human mind can devise. The swarm cannot counter what it cannot understand." Jake's stomach churned. "And if I say no?" Her eyes narrowed, golden and unyielding. "Then the Empire falls. And soon after, so will Earth." The weight of her words pressed down on him like a crushing tide. For a moment he said nothing, his mind racing. Then he straightened, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he said. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way." Sarathka allowed herself a faint smile. "I expected nothing less." As Jake turned back to the glowing crystal, a grim determination settled over him. If chaos and ingenuity were what the galaxy needed, he'd deliver. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the Empress was holding something back, and that the worst was yet to come. The Oblivion Swarm's hive loomed before them, a pulsating, biomechanical structure floating in the void of space. Its surface writhed with metallic tendrils and glowing veins of energy, as if the entire construct were alive. Jake Miller adjusted his stolen alien armor, its sleek design slightly too tight for his human frame. His heart pounded, but his face was set in determination. "Remember the plan," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We get in, plant the virus, and get out. No heroics." The small strike team nodded, their faces grim. Among them was Commander Arwaelvan, who, despite his initial disdain for Jake, now followed his lead. The others were elite soldiers, chosen for their skill and loyalty. None of them expected to make it back. The team entered through a breach in the hive's outer shell, their path illuminated by the sickly glow of the swarm's internal systems. The air was heavy with a metallic tang, and the walls seemed to pulse, as though the hive were aware of their presence. "Stay close," Jake whispered, scanning the surroundings with a makeshift device he'd cobbled together. Half alien tech, half human ingenuity. They moved through the hive's twisted corridors, dodging patrolling drones and automated defenses. Jake's device emitted a low hum, detecting patterns in the swarm's hive mind activity. Each step brought them closer to the core. "What's that smell?" one of the soldiers muttered. Jake smirked. "You don't want to know. Let's just say the swarm has a unique way of recycling its food." The soldier grimaced but pressed on. Finally, they reached the core chamber, an immense, spherical space filled with blinding light and cascading streams of data. At its center floated the hive mind itself, a massive, pulsating orb of energy and neural tendrils, connected to every part of the swarm. "This is it," Jake said, pulling a small device from his pack. It was a crude, improvised virus injector, built from Earth tech and alien components. As he approached the core, the hive mind reacted. The tendrils thrashed, and a deep, resonant voice echoed in their minds. "You are an anomaly, a speck of chaos in a sea of order. You cannot defeat us." Jake gritted his teeth, glaring at the orb. "Yeah, well, chaos is kinda my thing." The hive mind's tendrils lashed out, forcing Jake and the team to dive for cover. The soldiers opened fire, their weapons barely holding off the swarm's defenses. Jake scrambled toward the core, the injector clutched tightly in his hands. "Cover me," he shouted. Arwelvan surged forward, his blade cutting through a swarm drone. "Go, human! Finish this!" Jake reached the core and jammed the injector into its surface. The device activated with a sharp hiss, releasing the virus directly into the hive mind's neural pathways. The effect was immediate. The hive mind convulsed, its tendrils spasming as the virus disrupted its control. The swarm's drones collapsed, their connection severed. "You did it?" one of the soldiers exclaimed, but Jake didn't have time to celebrate. The core began to collapse, its energy destabilizing. "Run!" Jake yelled. The team sprinted through the crumbling hive, dodging falling debris and explosions. As they reached the breach, the hive imploded behind them, consumed by its own energy. Back on the extraction ship, Jake collapsed into a seat, exhausted but alive. The team cheered, but he remained silent, staring out at the void where the hive had been. Later, as the Empress greeted him back at the capital, her expression softened for the first time. "You saved us, Jake Miller. The galaxy owes you a debt it can never repay." Jake shrugged, his voice weary. "Just don't call me a hero. I'm just a guy who hates losing." The Empress smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but chaos has its place in the universe. And today it saved us all." Jake looked at her, his grin returning. "So, do I get a vacation now? Or are there more bug monsters to deal with?" Sarathka chuckled softly. "Rest, human. For now." As Jake leaned back, he couldn't help but think. Against all odds, he'd survived. And somehow, he'd become the galaxy's most unlikely weapon.